Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth.
If people only misbehave towards each other based on skin color, I would have had a very smooth entry to the United States in Bridgeport. When I arrived here, because of my background, the work I did before I came to college, my academic advisor insisted that I should go to the high school, public high schools in Bridgeport to speak and just share with the kids what I have traveled the world as a reporter. And I will tell you, even as a grown man till now, when I think about my experience in those classrooms, I shed tears. Black kids, no white person among them. They call me all kinds of names. They make fun of my accent. They ask me if I've ever slept with a lion. They ask me if I'm a booty scratcher. All kinds of things.
When you use the statement, slavery was never based on racism,
yes.
You are referencing countries all over the world.
Yeah, countries or,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, let's come to America.
Mm-hmm.
And speak in reference to the enslavement of African people in America.
Mm-hmm.
Would you still hold that view? Are you still saying that in America, slavery was never based on racism?
Yes. The same thing that spurred it in Africa, the same thing that caused it in Asia, the same thing that caused it in Europe is the same thing that caused it in America. That's all.
What caused it?
Economic needs. The weaker person, you can catch him. The Barbary gang, they were able to catch the northern Europeans of the Slavics and all these people because they were nearer to them, they can catch them. So whoever is weak for you to keep and use for your economic needs, slavery was purely based on economic needs.
Okay, so in America, are you saying that it was economic needs to choose and exclusively enslave black people?
Not exclusively enslave black people.
Again, we talk about the context of the enslavement.
It's not exclusively they chose black people. White people in Europe bought white people.
But we're talking about America.
Yes, Americans got black people to do the economic needs they want here.
Okay. And black people were the only people who were enslaved the way they were here in America, right?
Yeah.
So then the enslavement of a people here in America was based on race.
No. Why would it be based on race?
Why would it not be?
This is what self-hate sounds like. This is what defeat sounds like. This is what surrender sounds like. This is what cowardice sounds like. Someone like this belongs in the same category as the people who keep saying, "Don't call it white supremacy. They ain't supreme over me." Denial is usually the very first response that most people give to a circumstance that they don't feel like they have control over. And while that reaction is natural, the problem is denial doesn't change anything. And if you want a recipe for staying in the same position forever, go ahead and let denial become your mantra. We got black people trying to do all this magical thinking, pretending as if we're not oppressed. And if we just go ahead and pretend like we're not oppressed, that means that we aren't, right? Is that it? Obviously, the white supremacists are in charge, because we damn sure aren't. And the first step to overthrowing white supremacy is to admit to the nature of the threat and to its magnitude. Now, as for this guy who is running his mouth, Brother Tariq has often talked about how there's a lot of smart, dumb Negroes running around, people who think that they're so brilliant but in reality are plumb dumb. Well, in this guy's case, he's not a smart, dumb Negro, he's just a dumb Negro. This guy has the mentality that we, foundational black Americans, are the enemy. And don't let his recycling that old pathetic crap about I was called a booty scratcher way back in the day. That talking point is suspect as hell. First of all, that insult hasn't been used since like the 1970s or the 80s at the most. And while this guy is definitely old enough to have heard it, even if you believed him, that was decades ago. And if he's got to reach back 40 plus years to find something to be bitter about before many of you in the sound of my voice were even born, if that's how far back he's got to reach, that means he doesn't have anything. But make no mistake, for tethers like him, if it wasn't some sort of alleged insult that he was pointing to, then it would have been something else. This guy is only in the United States because of our efforts. If anything, he should be overlooking whatever alleged insults somebody might have thrown at him, because what he's received as a result of our efforts and our generosity is far greater. But look what he's saying. Obviously, this guy is saying this garbage because he's trying to suck up to the white powers that be. This guy went through his little litany talking about, well, the Chinese had slavery and the Indians had slavery, etc., and the Europeans had it too. Yeah, and in none of those cases did they decide that they were literally going to go all the way to another continent to get their slaves. When the Romans had slavery, they didn't go to Africa for their slaves. They went to Greece, Thracia, things like that. They went up into Northern Europe. They were getting their slaves from what today is called France and Germany and other places. That's where they went. When the Europeans were enslaving each other, they didn't do that by going to Africa. When the Indians were oppressing people like the Dalits, they didn't go to Africa to get their slaves. Nobody did that. The Chinese were not going down to Africa to get their slaves. They enslaved people right where they were. And the same thing goes for the Indians. Same thing goes for the Europeans. It wasn't until you get to the Americas that finally, you know what? The most convenient way to get our slaves is not enslaving the people who are next to us. You know, like this guy was saying. They were just enslaving whoever they could catch. Really? Then why the hell did they get on boats and they decide they would go to Africa? You had one of the popes who said, you are hereby authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel peoples. He didn't say the people closest to you. You had the Europeans sending all of their poor people by the millions. They had millions of dirt poor people that they were sending to what today is called Canada, what today is called Australia, and of course the 13 colonies that would eventually be called the United States. That's what they were doing with their European poor people, the people they could actually catch. They had indentured servitude. Wouldn't that have been the most convenient thing in the world to say, you know what? This indentured servitude, forget about that. You can't work off your debt. You're slaves and so are your kids henceforth and forevermore. That would have been the most convenient way. That would have been a form of slavery completely consistent with what all other forms of slavery around the world had been up until that time. But this guy, he decides he's going to give an ahistorical view of the world. I'm wondering if maybe he's actually auditioning to become a teacher in Ron DeSantis' Florida. With this level of deliberate, malignant ignorance of history, he would fit right in. The only way that you can try to rationalize chattel slavery in America as being somehow analogous to every other form of slavery that existed around the world is to lie. You have to sit there and invent a history that never existed. This guy sits here and contradicts himself. Because what he's saying isn't meant to make sense. It's meant to delight racist and anti-black bigots who hear this, so he hopes he can go ahead and ingratiate himself with them and get in good with them. He sits here in one breath and says, oh, we got these groups. They enslave people who were right in front of them, people from their own groups, their next door neighbors who they were enslaving. And then he looks at Africa and goes, well, that's just who they could catch. Yeah, because it was far more convenient to get on boats and literally sail weeks and weeks to get to Africa to get slaves, as opposed to all of these poor white people who were literally right in front of them, who they already had as indentured servants. All they had to do was simply do what the Romans did when they enslaved the British. Just simply issue an edict saying, hey, all of you poor Scots and all you poor Irish potato farmers and you poor Welshmen, you guys are going to be enslaved henceforth and forevermore. Wouldn't that have been the easiest way to do it? Because they already had them in hand. They were shipping these people out, exporting them to the four corners of the globe. They already had them. They already caught them. And then let them go and said, to hell with this. We're going to go ahead and get these black people instead. We're going to get on boats, sail for weeks and weeks to places we aren't even sure where the hell we're going, where the people don't speak the language, we have nothing in common with them at all, and then we're going to go ahead and hunt these people down, slap them in chains, put them on boats, and then we're going to sail them 90 freaking days. We could just do this with people in Europe, but it's much more convenient to go through all this instead. This is the least efficient way to do it. This is the hardest way to get your slaves. You don't do this because it's efficient. You do this because you have this pathetic idea of white supremacy that you're trying to enshrine by setting up a racial hierarchy. That's the reason why you do it. It becomes an end unto itself, not merely a means to an end. It becomes an end unto itself. Enslaving black people has value because you're trying to set up the idea that white people don't get treated like this. You're trying to give some sort of phony inherent value to whiteness. And on the other side, you're trying to give an inherent phony unworthiness and inferiority to being black. That's why you do it. See, when you've committed the biggest crime in human history, in order to try to whitewash it, you got to lie and lie huge. In fact, you got to tell the biggest lies that have ever been told. Yeah, it was all about race, but then again, when you're trying to kiss white supremacy's behind, these are the lies you got to tell. The real problem is this guy's ashamed that he even had to flee. And he's looking to deflect. So we're always the go-to for that. He wants crumbs from the dominant society. Buck dancing like this is always done as an audition for butter biscuits. Now, it is amusing in a perverted kind of way to see people who haven't done anything for black folks anywhere bestowing blanket amnesty on white supremacy for the worst crime in human history. Claiming that slavery wasn't about race, that's somebody who's clearly doing some rage bait nonsense. He's heard the Thomas Sowells and other idiots who have taught this kind of claptrap. And of course, what he's saying is blatantly false. The founders of white supremacy all the way through to the Confederacy, they wrote in all of their founding charters and documents that slavery against black people was racial, specifically racial. If it wasn't, then why is it that they weren't having white people like, say, the Irish in chattel slavery, where from one generation to the next, you were owned by these white folks in the Americas? Why did they single out black folks for that? You want to know why chattel slavery and colonialism even happened? You want to know why nothing has changed in Africa since the so-called independence movements of the 20th century? Individuals like this are the reason why. They were the ones who threw Africa's gates wide open to the enemy and gave an inappropriate response to the burgeoning slave trade and colonialism that was going on. And all the while denying it, telling themselves that, well, it ain't white supremacy that's on the march, it's these people over here complaining about nothing. Now, here's something else to be considered. Do you seriously believe that whatever white immigration person this guy spoke to be admitted into the U.S. didn't know this about him in advance? Do you think this guy was talking any differently about Africans when he was in Africa? One thing the dominant society has perfected for at least a few hundred years is the art of brain typing. Basically what that means is they try to measure somebody up and figure out what kind of person that they're dealing with. They're especially adept at this when it comes to athletes and entertainers. And when it comes to these tethers, they can sniff these guys out a mile away. This person owes everything he has to foundational black Americans. The only thing he ought to be doing is saying thank you 1,000 times. But he's not. Why is that? Because the fact that he's here makes him feel insecure about himself. That's the root of all of these insults. He feels insecure about himself because he had to flee. That messes with his head, makes him feel some kind of way. Now, we've never held that over his head. We never held it over any of these immigrants' heads. And yet for a lot of them, they got that in the back of their minds and often in the front of their minds whenever they're dealing with us. Because they're looking and going, well, I know what I would be thinking if I was in Nigeria or Namibia or whatever, and I saw some of you Americans flooding into the country by the tens of thousands per month. I know what I would think about you. That's what's going through his head. But also something else going through his head is he knows that we fight white supremacy. We've been fighting white supremacy for hundreds of years, the longest, most sustained freedom struggle in human history. And he also knows that that's something he didn't do. See, that's what's also going on in the back of his head. He's terrified that somebody's going to tell him, hey, sooner or later, you're going to have to actually fight white supremacy. This guy's not willing to sacrifice for anything. He's not willing to stand up to anyone. He's not willing to fight anything except for other black people. Now that he will fight, but he's not fighting the dominant society. He's not fighting white supremacy. And he's terrified that we're going to require him to. So what he's doing is he's trying to go ahead and start some preliminary begging now before hostilities even begin. While a lot of immigrants do show gratitude for the country that takes them in, it is a reality that there's a lot of immigrants who are beyond hypocritical when talking about their experience. They try to make it sound like the old country was better than the place that they fled to. And yeah, you got people who try to use that talking point that, well, immigrants, they work harder than native-born citizens. That's not true. I shot down that talking point in an earlier morning briefing. But if you want to talk about superior work ethic, tell me, how hard is it to book a boat ride or a plane ticket? How hard is that? You see, hard work is building the world's strongest economy, one that could support all of these tens and hundreds of millions of immigrants who have come to this country. See, that's what we did. That's hard work. Now, I don't know where this guy's from. I don't know what country he refugeed in from, but I'm willing to bet you wherever he's from, you're not going to find thousands, much less millions of people trying to get into the place. This guy feels ashamed every time he looks in the mirror. What he's trying to do is he's trying to overcompensate for those feelings of inferiority and worthlessness. Nobody said anything to him to make him feel inferior, but he knows what he would be thinking. Because if you look at these foreign countries, how do they treat foreigners who try to get into their countries? You look at these foreign countries you see in Mexico, South America, wherever, they hate people who come to their countries as economic migrants. They hate economic refugees. I say economic migrants because these other countries, they don't allow people to come in and try to claim some sort of asylum. For these other countries, if you want to try to claim asylum, you have to do it outside of their country in an embassy, outside of their country. You don't get to show up at their border and say, I'm seeking asylum. See, black people broke down so many of the barriers and opposition that these other people were too scared to fight in their own home countries. So when they get here, they're already looking at us and thinking, yeah, we probably know what you guys are thinking about us. And that's something to understand about opportunists. At some point, they will turn and give you the middle finger to your face after you save their lives. They'll go from falsely claiming persecution to then saying that their home country is better than yours, even though they fled to be in your country. And then on a long enough timeline, a lot of them will begin telling you the truth and say that they were trying to get over on someone and you let them in, so you deserve whatever happens. What was it Brother Tariq was talking about? You had some woman who was saying, I didn't come here to build or to contribute. I came here to take. In order for people to have even a modicum of dignity, they have to be able to look in the mirror and see an individual who happens to have a certain amount of force of personality. That's what they have to be able to see when they look in the mirror. They have to look and see somebody who stands for something. And that's borne by the stripes that you carry. Well, what happens when you're a tether? When you look in the mirror, basically what you see is nothing. And what do you call a creature that sees nothing when it looks in the mirror? You see, these are the things that go through the minds of a tether whenever they think about foundational black Americans. They look at us and they see everything that they're not. See, these tethers, they're the ones who destroyed these African countries. They're the ones who left Africa wide open to every invader from the Hyksos to the South Koreans. In these other countries where people like this refuse to actually do the work, they're used to an environment of turncoats and backstabbing. This is what Dr. John Henrik Clarke talked about. A broken loyalty system. That's the real problem that these people have in these foreign countries. They don't work together because they can't trust each other. Tribalism, nepotism, sectarianism, this is what it causes. We didn't cultivate that amongst ourselves here, though. We cultivated a definition of blackness that crossed all lines, and it worked. You don't see all of that kind of dysfunction amongst us. You got immigrants coming from different places, even though you got all of these migrants who sit there and claim the exact same script, whether they be from Jamaica, whether they be from Africa, whether they be from wherever. They know the rules of racism. They all try to invoke the same old hard-working immigrant narrative. And yet whenever they come into foundational black Americans, the insecurities come to the surface. Donald Trump and Elon Musk are putting the screws to Africa right now. Musk already said we'll coup whoever we want when he was talking about lithium in South America. Now, what do you think goes through that reprobate's empty little head when he talks about Africa? He's a reject from apartheid South Africa, and his disdain for the black majority there is a reflection of his hatred for black people everywhere. Unfortunately, you can't tell that to people like this. These clowns see black Americans as the enemy because their jealousy and envy and self-loathing at their own failure makes them hate us. They're not going to stand up to white supremacy, so they might as well go ahead and talk trash about us as they see it. Fortunately, not all the brothers and sisters from Africa, the Caribbean, and all points in between are like this. Fortunately, we got dyed-in-the-wool soldiers amongst us who may not be from our lineage, but they're definitely of our ideology. The problem, though, is the people who this racist government's been letting in for the last 60-plus years, they've mostly been individuals like this. That's what they do. They want to make sure that they weed out all of the true soldiers and they let in only the tethers as a means to try to undermine us. That's the point. As Black Media Appreciation Month comes to a close, we should give thanks that we finally have a media that's pushing back against the sock puppets that white power set up to undermine us. Until now, there wasn't a critical mass of voices pushing back against these kind of lying narratives. When you look at certain sectors in the society, particularly in the white media and academics, you'll also see a disproportionate number of tethers represented there. And when I say the white media, I don't merely mean suck-ups like Cynthia Erivo who are in front of the cameras. I'm talking about white media executives and producers and the like. You'll find a whole lot of folks with these foreign names that are represented among the producers, executives in these corporations. That's no accident. Let this be yet another reminder of why it is that the black media should be appreciated. Because it's given us the ability to push back against lies like this. The corrupt and cowardly criminals who have been mismanaging the continent of Africa are just like this guy. And it's going to require the brothers and sisters in Africa and the Caribbean to do some house cleaning. Sooner or later, these tethers are going to have to be stood up to and faced down. See, the Tethers, they always try to talk that, well, America's not racist, there's no racism here, and these white supremacists, they aren't so bad when you think about it. They always try that mess right up until these white supremacists show their true colors and give these guys the boot. We've seen it over and over again. After that, they start to try talking like, I was the spook that sat by the door. I was trying to spy on those white supremacists for you. That's what they try to do whenever white supremacy has kicked them to the curb. But they know that with the black media out here, they're not going to be able to take off their enemy uniform and try to blend in among the native population. That ain't going to happen. And that's the point of this morning's briefing. It's to give thanks to the black media for the work that we've put in. Because tethers like this may be able to run their mouths, but thanks to the work that we've been putting in, FBA and non-FBA alike, the tethers will no longer be able to run from their own reputation. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Semesta Hobson, 2 Gigabyte Entertainment, Saifa Chaudhuri, Turk McKenzie, and Nico Wormworth. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.